Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's start with news from today's Parliament sitting. The Supply Reallocation of Appropriated Expenditure Bill has been passed after 111 MPs voted in favour. Now 106 MPs voted against the bill, while 5 MPs were absent. So in the total of 222 MPs, that means exactly half of the MPs voted in favour of this bill. So no changes, at least on a cursory look, no changes in allegiances so far. That's the same number that we saw in the July 13th call to vote to remove the then Speaker of the Dewan Rakyat.
Yeah. Is this significant, Melissa? I'm not entirely sure, but of course, people who are looking for leadership that might produce maybe some sort of national consensus, this is clearly not the moment for that. There's also, I guess, on the horizon, the COVID-19 bill. We'll see that those numbers also significant. But when you look at the pushback against the supply bill, and Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, arguing against it, saying the government is already bloated. That in fact, what this government does not demonstrate is the kind of discipline that's necessary. And he points to the creation of a full ministerial positions, envoys to the Middle East, to China, to the Far East, and none of which I think have been really monitored. We don't know what they're doing, really.
Well, I don't think they can go anywhere with borders closed at the moment. But, this is the supplementary supply bill. It is seeking 7.18 billion ringgit, the bulk of that money. The idea is to have this extra money to restructure the PN government after the change of government from at the beginning of the year. The bulk of that money, that 7 billion ringgit, is expected to go to the Prime Minister's department, that they're expected to get 310 million ringgit. The new National Unity Ministry will be allocated 240 million ringgit, and the Rural Development Ministry will get about 190 million ringgit if this bill goes through. And I'm quite curious to know, curious that this bill did not get bipartisan support. And the question is, how do we, are there some bills that will get bipartisan support as opposed to the others in this very razor-thin margins?
Right. There's also the question of who's getting the bulk of the money, and because political power comes from having those kind of allocations. The PM's department again getting the bulk, and the PM's department becoming somewhat of a super ministry. I think this has been a growing trend over the last decade or so, right? So the power of the PM's department now, because confirmed again in the way in which this budget is being allocated.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to other news. We have the former Youth and Sports Minister, Syed Abdul Rahman. He has questioned government leaders if they agree with the Higher Education Ministry's decision to maintain the Universities and University Colleges Act, or better known as the UUCA. Now, this is the law that prevents tertiary level students from voicing out their political views. And this comes after last month the Education Ministry, the Higher Education Ministry that is, had said that it was scrapping the former Pakatan Harapan government's plan to abolish the UUCA. They claimed that this act remains, to quote them, relevant.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, because the question is whether the current government's position on the UCCA and all the ramifications coming from it squares with the mood on the ground, especially with the Pakatan Harapan's Undi 18 initiative lowering the voting age and the kind of excitement it's created in young people, especially those who are very politically aware. This decision to keep what is seen as a central plank in authoritarian regimes, over the decades, kind of control over young people. Now, the fact that the optics of it, I think, are very interesting. And I think Syed Saddiq was seen debating with a former comrade of his, Wan Faisal, the Deputy Minister of Youth and Sports, who used to be on the same, they used to be on the same side, they're no longer on the same side. I think that optics very interesting. I don't know how it plays out in the ground for young people.
Yeah, optics one thing, right? But also how is that going to impact sentiment, how young people feel about it? Because seriously, if we're talking about the Undi 18 initiatives, and talking about increasing political awareness among young people, how do we do that if we don't begin at universities? And why is it that universities are considered such a scary ground? You know, why
For
won't we
governments.
for governments?
For
Yeah.
governments, absolutely. So, you know, you can imagine, you know, decades-long control of young people through the university, at least tertiary level students. I don't know if it's going to have a material effect on how young people actually operate in the world, Melissa. There are many ways to be politically active, even if you're at university under the current legislative infrastructure or architecture, as it were.
Right.
So, will young people be held back if the UCCA is not repealed? I'm not sure if it's going to have that kind of effect, but it certainly does tell you about this government's political agenda, its political values,
Right.
and then of course at the end of the day, it's whether people want to support this agenda.
Yeah, well, and this is, I think, telling of the Perikatan government's, Perikatan National Government's stand on legislative reform. Okay, folks, we're going to take a quick break, but after this, we will be speaking to the Election Commission to discuss the latest announcement on the Sabah elections. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa. Idris. With me is Sharaad, Kuttan. The Election Commission has fixed the 26th of September for the Sabah state elections, while nominations will be held on the 12th of September. Now, before we get into that, let's first take a quick look at the Slim by-election first. Now, last Saturday was nomination day, and following that, campaigning has officially begun under strict COVID-19 guidelines to be monitored by the EC. Joining us on the show tonight, we have Dr Azmi Sharom, Deputy Chairperson of the Election Commission. Azmi, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. I know it's been a very busy day, but can you begin by telling us what lessons the EC learnt from the CHINI by-election that will be applied to the Slim by-election?
I presume you're talking about the COVID-19 SOPs.
Yes.
Because what's on people's minds. What we learned in CHINI was that we can conduct an election with COVID SOPs in place and still manage to ensure that those who want to vote have time to vote. We had a 70% turnout in CHINI. But in SLIM, the lessons that we've learned from CHINI is that there were some measures that we took which were rather slow. Some of the measures in place, for example, the use of a brush for the ink. So now we've changed that. In SLIM, we will be instead focusing on the sanitizing of hands throughout the whole process of voting. So when you come into the voting room, you sanitize your hands. After you dip your finger in ink, you sanitize your hands again. Then you get your ballot paper, and then before you leave the center, you sanitize your hand once more. So we have changed the procedure a little bit, and we're quite sure this will still ensure that the public's health will still be protected.
Azmi, to what extent, do you anticipate election violations? I understand that the MACC is also setting up in SLIM to monitor the possibility of corrupt practices. Have you seen potentially a kind of downtrend in terms of, those kinds of violations, considering the kind of environment that we're living in now?
Well, there's always accusation of corrupt practices. I don't have the figures to suggest there's a downtrend. There will always be complaints, but this is something that has been put in place over the past year or so, where the MACC are stationed in the constituency where the by-election is being held to provide an immediate presence. So all I can say here is that if someone was to see what they believe is a corrupt practice, for example, bribery or anything of that sort, then there will be an MACC presence in SLIM, and please make a report as soon as possible.
Okay. Well, you've announced that the EC is setting up 2 election campaign enforcement teams to monitor the campaign activities by the candidates. Azmi, is compliance with SOPs, especially by politicians, difficult to enforce?
This will be the first time that we're really testing it because, the reality is that in CHINI, there wasn't much of a competition. Because there was only one party who was competing, and then there were two independent candidates. So there wasn't your usual, one big party versus another party. So Slim would be the first time where we will see an actual fight happening, I suppose. Perhaps it's a wrong term. Competition, a proper competition happening. And all we can say is that we've already given all the political parties what the SOPs are, and we hope that they play their part as responsible Malaysian citizens and ensure that they follow the SOP to protect not just the voters, but everyone living in that area and beyond.
Okay. Well, let's move on to Sabah then. The Election Commission has just made an announcement of the important dates for the Sabah state elections. You've fixed 26th of September for the state elections, nominations on the 12th of September. Azmi, what challenges is the EC anticipating from Sabah elections?
It's the same challenges that we will have in Slim and CHINI, but in 73. Because of the, because it's a state election, and there are now 73 state seats. In the past, Sabah has, for the past few decades, Sabah has had their state elections at the same time as the federal elections, the general elections, the parliamentary elections. And so we have suddenly an increased number of returning officers who have to be trained. And most of them are brand new at this, because in the past we only had like 26 or 25 returning officers, because that's the number of parliamentary seats. But now we have 73. So approximately 40 new returning officers and their assistants have to be trained. So that's one of the challenges. Of course, the COVID challenge remains the same, but it's just multiplied because it's just that many more constituencies to deal with.
Azmi, will the MUSA AMAN'S suit regarding the dissolution of the State Assembly have a material effect on these elections?
Only if the court decides to tell us to stop, But until that happens, as far as the Election Commission is concerned, our duties remain the same, and we will continue to prepare. It would not be very wise, because some people said that we shouldn't be preparing, but if we stop preparing and then suddenly 3 weeks, 4 weeks down the line, the court says, yeah, go ahead, then we'll be too far behind to be able to run the election. So we will continue to prepare unless and until told otherwise by the court.
Azmi, another question about the EC and its capacities. Considering the pandemic, there have been calls to allow for voters, Sabahans living outside the state, to vote outside the state and not travel, all in the interest of public health. Is the EC empowered to innovate? At this point in time, could it make such an allowance for Sabahans to vote from outside the state?
At the moment, I mean, depending on what method you are suggesting, but really there's two elements. One is legal, one is practical. For the practical purposes, I mean, if you take postal ballots, for example, right, to include such a large number of people into our to be postal voters. Considering the fact that, in all honesty, our postal voting system needs a lot of work and improvement, we were of the opinion that this would cause more problems than it solves. So it's not something that we should rush into. Innovative ideas, although they might be very, very helpful, it's something that has to be done with care and with a lot of precise work and decision making.
Do you have a timeline, Azmi, as to when you can resolve some of these obstacles?
I don't have a timeline, but I can assure you that we do have a working committee specifically on postal voting and what we can do to improve things. And also we are looking at other alternatives as well. For distance voting, but these are all things which have to be studied properly and discussed properly and with engagement with all the stakeholders. It's not something that can be rushed.
Azmi, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. So we appreciate your time as well. You sharing the EC's point of view on this. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Joining us on the line now, we have Thomas Fann. He's the chairman of Bersih 2.0. Good evening, Thomas. Welcome back to the show. I want to ask you what Bersih's chief concerns are with regard to, let's begin with the Slim by-election. What are the concerns that Bersih has with those elections?
Thank you, Melisa and Sharaad. Our main concern during this time is, number one, the safety of the voters during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because when we were at the last by-election in CHINI, we observed that there were new protocols put in place, which are very commendable by the EC. But we also saw that some EC staff were not familiar with this protocol, and there were lapses that could have resulted in the spread of COVID-19 or other diseases. So we hope that this time the training will be given more thoroughly to some of these who will be involved in handling voters on that day, during the polling day. The second concern I think we have is, as always, it's the abuse of state resources by the state or the federal government. And as we know that right now the Slim is in Para State, so we are going to watch carefully the Para State government and also the federal government, whether they will be abusing state resources to help their party win votes. Now, I have to say that there is currently no law against it, but it is certainly unethical to abuse state resources because it gives you an unfair advantage over your opponent during elections.
So, Thomas, if there is no, in fact, illegality in using state machinery, resources, to give an advantage, you say, to certain candidates, then what is the incentive to not do it? I mean, what pressures could be applied on the contending parties to stop this particular practice?
Well, law doesn't exist right now, but we hope one day there will be a law. But I think for now, public awareness that this is an unethical practice would deter competing candidates and parties from doing this because they may be punished by voters on the ground if voters are aware that you are just using actually taxpayers' money for your own party. That's, to put it bluntly, that's what is happening when you abuse state resources.
Thomas, can I ask you about the Sabah state elections? The Election Commission has just announced today that they fixed the 26th of September as polling day. And they've also said that absentee voting for Sabah voters living outside the territory is not possible for now. I'm wondering what would allow for a process that is genuinely democratic if the reality is that the legal and logistical limitations won't allow for postal voting?
Yeah, I think it's two different matters here. I think Bersih on the 2nd of August called for postal voting to be allowed for Sabahans who are residing in Peninsular Malaysia or in Sarawak to vote from where they are right now rather than having to fly back all the way to Sabah. Now, postal voting is where they receive their ballot in the post and then they post it back to the returning officer of their constituency. Now, absentee voting is where they have early voting at a designated location, or sometimes it's called remote voting. For example, there is a huge clusters of Sabahan in Pasir Gudang, Johor, for example. A center could be set up there 5 days, say, before actual polling day, so that people, Sabahan can come and cast their vote there. then these votes will be either counted immediately or kept and sent back to their constituency to be counted. So it's two different things. But as we understand it, there's no legal impediment to hold postal voting. While there may be some amendment needed to the regulations to hold absentee voting. But we have been calling for postal voting, and frankly, we are quite disappointed that this is not happening this time due to some technical issue.
Thomas, we just spoke to Azmi Sharom just before the break. Before we spoke to you, we spoke to Azmi Sharom, Deputy Chairman of the Election Commission. I'm just wondering, he said that this is not something to be rushed. It needs to be looked at and studied and stakeholders engaged. Do you agree with that?
Well, this issue of postal voting for Sabahan and Sarawakian was actually raised in 2012 by the Special Parliamentary Select Committee chaired by Dr. Maximus Ong Kili. This was a recommendation 8 years ago. How much more time do you need to even improve a process? I'm saying that this excuse is getting quite lame, but we hope that it will be in time for the upcoming Sarawak state election, which could be called within a year or less from now. But I believe that it can be done if the EC put their best brain to it.
Thomas, we've seen around the world, of course, elections, and most recently, the call by the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, to postpone elections. I think just by a month, but in order to put certain, practices into place. Do you think, when you look around the world, Thomas, today, the arguments about having elections, because these involve mass gatherings at the time of a pandemic, what lessons would you like us and our stakeholders and institutions to draw from what's happening around the world?
Well, I think certainly it is responsible for election commissions worldwide to consider the spread of COVID-19. But it's so important for us to know that democracy cannot be suspended due to a pandemic. And secondly, that elections are being held worldwide, even during this time. Singapore just successfully held their general election just a month ago, and earlier before that we had South Korea and other countries as well. So it is possible to do to hold election, but I think it has to be done with full awareness and cooperation with the Ministry of Health, to ensure that this doesn't become a time for COVID to spread out of control.
Thomas, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. That's all we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.